Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzieh Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Is there a peace deal or not? Is there a fight for the presidency or not? Will the country have stability? These are just some of the questions being asked about the future of Afghanistan 18 years after American troops invaded this country with its alleged war on terrorism. Now the U.S. and the Taliban have reached a peace deal, but many in Afghanistan are asking, where is the peace and what does it all mean? This in a country which hasn't seen peace since 1979. We're going to start off the program crossing over to Kabul and talk to Press TV's correspondent there on the ground, Amin Alami. Amin, thanks so much for being with us. Well, fill us in on this latest situation. Exactly where is Afghanistan standing right now?
Well, despite the recent strong stance of the Afghan President Mohammad Ashraf Ghani regarding to the release of Taliban prisoners from Afghan jails, the Afghan National Security Council's spokesperson confirmed that the Afghan government has postponed the release of these Taliban prisoners from jails due to various reasons and causes. According to Jawed Faisal, the spokesperson of Afghanistan's National Security Council, the Afghan government needs more time to review the list of these Taliban prisoners. Secondly, he also stressed that the Taliban leaders must guarantee that the released prisoners will not return back to the battlefields and join against in fighting against the Afghan military forces across this country. But let's not forget that the Taliban militant group has already stressed that the U.S. Representative Zalmay Khalilzad as the only authorized person from the U.S. side during the peace negotiations has assured the Taliban militant group for the release of a number of 5,000 Taliban militants from Afghan jails, and that any decision by the Afghan government is not valuable for the Taliban militant group. In the meantime, here in the Afghan society, the story has also created mixed reactions among Afghan people. Many here back the stance of the Afghan president, saying that those Taliban militants who are currently in the Afghan jails have committed many crimes against humanity, against democracy, and against many other values such as human rights and women's rights in this country. But in the meantime, some others also say that the release of these Taliban prisoners will also pave the way for a direct peace negotiation between the Afghan government and the Taliban militant group in order to bring a lasting peace in this country. In fact, peace for the people of Afghanistan is considered as a sweet dream. They also say that this is not only the Afghan government or the Taliban militant group who need to pay attention regarding to bringing peace and stability in this country, but the regional players, international players, all need to act honestly when it comes to paying attention and paying respect to the rights of the Afghan nation as a nation among the rest of nations in this globe.
All right, thank you so much for that update out of Kabul. That's Press TV's correspondent on the ground there, Amin Alami. I'd like to actually introduce my guest to this program now, Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer out of San Francisco, and Ken O'Keefe, former U.S. Marine out of Salem, Oregon. Thank you both for being with us. Let's start off with Scott in San Francisco. Well, Scott, what is going on in Afghanistan? I mean, let's start off with having two swearing-in ceremonies for the presidency, as both Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah have claimed the presidency. I mean, what do you make of it all?
Well, Margie, as you know well, and as my esteemed colleague Ken O'Keefe knows even better, this all started in 2001 with the false flag attack of 9/11 that was blamed on Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda roots. Of course, that was completely false. It was a false flag artificial attack designed to take down 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Afghanistan. And thus, the great invasion and the great disruption of the world started in 2001 and has lasted ever since. And I know personally, Afghanistan's and opium production was a key target of the CIA in funding a lot of its black operations. I discovered that in a report called Deep Black, and I reported it. And of course, I was castigated by the military and by the political Obama administration and the Hillary Clinton administration. So the military-industrial complex and the CIA have long coveted Afghanistan's drug-rich cash cow potential. And that really is a large motivating factor behind this whole invasion. We find ourselves 20 years later, essentially, with civil war, strife, chaos, and thousands of American lives lost, and many, many other crippled and traumatized beyond all recollection. And the American people have had enough, and they're demanding removal. They voted in President Trump because he claimed to be committed to doing that. And this perhaps is one small step in that direction, but it's been 18 years too late. So now the U.S. is quickly trying to cobble together some Kabul peace agreement. Of course, it is littered with strife and chaos between the incumbent in Afghanistan, President Ashraf Ghani, and the chief executive, Abdullah, now engaging in almost a civil war. So
Stay
I
with
think
me,
the U.S.
Scott. Stay with me, Scott. I know you have a lot of points to make, but let me get Ken involved in this conversation. I mean, Ken, what's your take on the peace deal between the United States and the Taliban?
Well, the first thing that I believe is important to mention here is that the Taliban, being a non-Muslim myself, but having heavy respect for Islam and the true meaning of Islam, the Taliban does not represent true Islamic values. And in fact, the Taliban is littered and has always been littered with infiltrators, agents of the United States and its allies around the world, in particular the Western countries such as England. And ultimately, what we have now in Afghanistan is a battle between true Islam in many respects, which is held by the vast majority of people throughout not only Afghanistan, but the world. So that's number one. We need to consider the fact that Islam is not being properly represented at all uniformly throughout Western media. Secondly, there is a tribal reality to Afghanistan, which makes a one-size-fits-all sort of nation next to impossible, because you have people who live in regions that are very remote, very isolated. They have their own way of living, and whether we agree or disagree, if you believe in self-determination and national sovereignty, then the people within the nation have the right to decide for themselves. And the U.S. has consistently and indisputably been interfering in the internal affairs of nations around the world, especially those which pose a problem for the United States, i.e. those that will not bow before an imperial master. So the idea that the U.S. would actually seek peace in itself is an insult to the intelligence of humanity, because since when has the United States been carrying out policies? I'm talking about policy, not words. Anybody can speak words. Words mean nothing unless backed by meaningful action. And where is the meaningful action with regard to the United States?
Stay with me, Ken. Stay with me, Ken. Scott, how is it that the deal has been signed and basically doesn't leave the Afghan government with any room to maneuver, because Washington has made this agreement with the Taliban? I mean, what do you make of this?
I think this is the Trump administration's admission that the government of Afghanistan is chaotic and selfish and narcissistic and riddled with squabbling and tribal conflicts and internecine disagreements. And the Trump administration is trying to divorce itself of it. It's had enough. And it realizes this is an election year, and if the president fails in Afghanistan at removing the United States, symbolically, he will be losing potentially at the election ballot when the American voters go. So I think this is pure politics, pure election tactical maneuvering, so that in 6 months the president can say we are actively accelerating our departure from Afghanistan. It's not going to be 14 months. It's going to be by Labor Day of 2020, so that it's ready for political advertising for November 7th, 2020. So this is really the president trying to seal a deal very quickly to save face, to save honor. And I think we're going to witness Afghanistan fall into just really worse tribal civil war conflict. I think the Taliban, unless they are repressed by the Afghan government, which it can only do with air support and drone support from the U.S. So I don't think the U.S. is going to be departing from the fight. I think they're going to be leaving drones and drone bases in Pakistan or different parts of Afghanistan to try and police and control the Taliban maneuvers. But I think this is going to turn into a bloody mess.
Well, Ken, I mean, part of this agreement is that the government should release thousands of Taliban prisoners before the intra-talks begin. How logical is this move?
Again, we have to consider that many within those that have been incarcerated, labeled Taliban or not, each one of them is an individual. And I am a firm believer in law. If these individuals have been involved in criminal activity against the nation and have injured or killed innocent civilians in the process of affecting their political agenda, then they have committed a crime and they should be prosecuted. Those that have not, that there is no evidence, they may be lumped in with the label Taliban as Islam, Muslims. You know, we have implied through Western media and even just blatantly propaganda-wise said flat out that Islam is inherently violent, that Islam is inherently anti-Jewish, that Islam is anti-life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as the dream illusion of America is. And the fact is that it's all about sowing the seeds of chaos. In fact, my esteemed colleague, who I return the favor, Mr. Bennett, is well-informed and very accurate when he talks about everything to do with this particular subject. He would know. He is a former psychological operations officer in the U.S. military, and he would know firsthand exactly the tactics that are used to sow the seeds of chaos. So I also agree with Mr. Bennett that ultimately this is all a symbolic gesture to look like there's some sort of peace in time for an election cycle. But in truth, there's not going to be any peace. It's only going to be a symbolic gesture and not have any real substance behind it.
Okay, well, Scott, in the symbolic piece, as Ken and both yourself has said, in this time frame, because we still have months before the election in the United States, I mean, do you think that the government in Afghanistan will actually agree to releasing these prisoners? And even if it's not going to be a real peace, the risks of doing this, especially if these are prisoners who committed crimes?
I think the prisoners, once released, would immediately go right back onto the battlefield in some capacity. The Taliban are used to waging war by deception, and I don't think they would honor any agreement. And that is where the Afghan government is between a rock and a hard place, as it wants a genuine peace and ceasefire and an ability to thrive, but yet the Taliban in its agenda is no doubt seeking to dominate all areas of public life and political life in Afghanistan, and that's something, you know, really the West can't tolerate, or else it's you know, going to be exposed as the great hypocrite that it is. It's a tragedy that we've had 20 years without any sort of a phasing of a psychological training or conditioning or population education in Afghanistan by the U.S. military. Every commander that has entered Afghanistan has brought his different own unique psychological operation campaign, and the new commander discards the prior one. So every single year, when a new commander is coming into Afghanistan, the old has been thrown out and we've started from scratch. And we've wasted an entire generation of young people that could have been educated and brought up in a semi-constitutional understanding, living in peace, prospering, entrepreneurship, business, just general social customs, divorced from the hate and hostility and animosity, which have duly been earned by the United States by its chaos and destruction campaign. But yet it's the American people have been betrayed greatly in this, never mind the world's population that have suffered, but the American people have been duped and lied to and deceived by people like Senator Lindsey Graham and, of course, George Bush and Dick Cheney and Barack Obama later on and Hillary Clinton. This whole 20 years of American criminal, deep state, political, corrupt that have dominated American foreign policy have decimated the trust of the American people in their government and their veterans.
Okay.
And it's also decimated the trust of foreign countries. Nobody trusts the United States, rightly spoken.
Yeah, you were talking about as far as the trust about the American people, and actually, Ken, I was going to ask about the trust of the Afghan people and really what they have been through. And now still at somewhat of a crossroads, as, again, I would go back to the agreement and saying that so many of these so-called Taliban fighters have to be released, and the likelihood of them going back into the trenches and fighting. I mean, what does it all mean for the people of Afghanistan?
It means, sadly, that there's going to be a lot more innocent blood shed, and ultimately this is all a very predictable consequence of U.S. policy throughout the region and, in fact, around the world. I would like to ask the audience to entertain the idea of at what point has the United States genuinely sought peace, and how do its actions run consistent with any notion of peace? All I see is an American nation gone mad, drunk on power, which pumps ungodly amounts of money into the military, and yet military men like myself are treated as human guinea pigs, in which we were forcefully ordered to take experimental drugs. Under the Clinton administration, I was treated as a human guinea pig, as was 600,000 of us. And the only ones who ever died from what's known as Gulf War syndrome are us, the Americans, and the English. And we're the only ones who took this cocktail of experimental drugs through injections and pills, which has killed many and caused birth defects and many other things. So that's the way the United States government and military treats its own military service members like myself. And I'm going to quote Henry Kissinger, who's a fitting way to end this segment. Henry Kissinger said the military are, quote, nothing but dumb animals to be used. That's an honest statement from Henry Kissinger, and I'll have to give him respect for at least being honest there.
Wow. Well, Scott, I mean, back to the topic at hand, though. With the agreement, the Taliban has agreed to now cease its attacks on the Afghan government as well as on American soldiers, and the U.S. has agreed to take all of its troops out of Afghanistan. Your take on all of this, do you think that the United States will really take its troops out of Afghanistan?
I think the only way that it would do that, Marzia, realistically, is in a joint operation between perhaps China, Iran, Russia, the neighboring countries stepping in and playing a part in the political, social, economic, military stabilization of the country. This is the new paradigm, politically speaking, and I think Russia is emerging as a very strong, trusted entity to do a lot of that, based on its success between Syria and Turkey, and Iran, of course, has played a great role in the stabilization of a lot of these fires and conflicts that were started by the Zionist Israeli Mossad and the CIA and the MI6. So now I think we're approaching a position of the world politically, and perhaps the coronavirus has accelerated this realization that countries need to bond together and stand and work together on joint political, economic agendas that simply recognize the sovereignty of countries And as Ken O'Keefe wisely said, the ability of people to live and thrive and prosper and grow according to their own destiny. The United States is not the controller of the world, the policeman of the world, or the high priest of the world. And I think it's being thrown off in that capacity. The U.S. should embrace the idea of a multipolar world, as many great thinkers and writers have talked about. And in embracing a multipolar world, the world is much more stable. It's much more safe.
But of course, Scott, that sounds great. It sounds idealistic, and but we know that that is not the case. So, Ken, what is key here? I mean, we talk about if things continue to be the same, it's not going to end well. What would have to happen, in your perspective, to turn things around in Afghanistan?
You know, anybody who has watched my commentary, whether it's this subject or any other related subject, when it comes to geopolitics, I see one solution that stands out, glaring at us, that is absolutely the definer as to whether or not we actually turn this world around and create something that we can hand to our children and feel proud about and know that they'll be able to live in dignity, and that is law. And there are such agreements amongst nations right now, which actually outline in detail as a contract. When you buy a car, you sign a contract. And in that contract, you make agreements. Now, if you breach that contract, you will be held to task. Maybe your car will be repossessed. Maybe your wages will be garnished. Now, in terms of international law, there are treaties. Now, treaties are contracts among nations. One of the treaties the United States has entered into is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a binding treaty. Under that treaty, it is bound to not only respect those terms in international law, but domestically. So, for instance, my right to travel is infringed upon. This is just me as a personal example. The TSA, Transport and Security Administration, or Homeland Insecurity, as I call them, they've denied me the right to fly recently, literally. And I have not even a misdemeanor on my record. But the Israelis say that I'm an operative of the Hamas terror regime. And the government that's sitting there in the White House and in Congress right now, which all held their hand up and swore to uphold the U.S. Constitution, almost all of them have committed treason. And according to the laws of the United States, they can be, and in many cases should be, executed according to the laws of this nation.
Okay, I would love to continue this conversation, and Ken, hopefully we can, but we're out of time right now. I appreciate both of you guys being with me. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer out of San Francisco, and Ken O'Keefe, former U.S. Marine out of Oregon. And I appreciate you viewers being with us on another debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi signing off for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you next time.